Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final plenary session of our conference. It gives me great pleasure and it's a great honor to have amongst us Professor Orazio Attanasio. I'm going to just very briefly introduce you to him, and I'm sure many of you already know of his work. Professor Attanasio is the Jeremy Bentham Chair of Economics at the University College London. He's also the Research Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London. He's a Fellow of the Econometric Society and the British Academy, and he also served as the President of the European Economic Association in 2014. Professor Attanasio is the President-elect also of the Econometric Society in 2020. And these are just some of his affiliations. I could go on, but I would want to now also talk about his research, which spans a wide range of topics, essentially in labor economics, and has had a deep impact on understanding of household consumption, household saving behavior, labor supply, and more recently, his work has focused on policy design in developing countries, especially focusing on the evaluation of conditional cash transfers, education policies in developing countries, and more broadly in the area of human capital accumulation. And in this ongoing work that he has in developing countries, his projects are going on in Mexico, in Colombia, Chile, as well as in India. So today's the work that he is going to present to us is work that he is conducting in India on human capital accumulation and in particular on early childhood development. So with more than 18,000 citations on Google Scholar and counting as I speak, I think it would be a rare economist who has not come across his work and been inspired by it. So with no further ado, let me please let's all of us welcome Professor Attanasio, and the floor is yours. So just to clarify,
Oh yeah, I
we'll
can.
go for 15 minutes,
Okay.
and then we'll have question
Okay.
and answers.
Okay. Can you hear me? This works? So thanks very much for the nice words. And thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be back in Delhi. I hadn't been here for almost 2 years, so it's nice to be back. The way when I received the invitation, I agonized whether to present a paper or to present a more general lecture on a research agenda, and I opted for the latter. So I'll be talking about some of the work that our group has been doing on intervention to foster early childhood development. And I'll try to focus on some of the main challenges that we have, and then discuss some pieces of work that could be used as examples of this, some of which is happening in India. So this is work that I've been doing with lots of people. These are a group of people, some of them economists, some not, that work on child development. And I will take freely from work that has been done with these guys, with these people. As Prasanna said, some of the projects have been doing in Colombia, and so these are some of the co-authors involved in the Colombia project, and these are the co-authors involved in the India work. I will also talk briefly at the end about some new work that we are doing in Ghana, and so these are the people involved in Ghana. So that's the outline of my talk. I'll start with an introduction, trying to give a motivation for what we are doing. One of the big challenges, I think, is that we face is scalability of interventions. And so I will talk about that, and I'll give you some examples and discuss scalability. And then I move on to some examples of specific projects. And I will take two types of interventions aimed at early childhood development, some based on home visits and some based on group visits, and then conclude. As a general motivation, I should say that the work on human development has received a recently renewed attention and is perceived to be extremely important, including in economics. Partly because human capital is perceived as an important driver of economic growth and economic progress. And this issue is particularly relevant in developing countries where disadvantaged children might be affected by, might be living in particularly vulnerable conditions and therefore affected by a number of problems. But the issues are also relevant in developed countries. In fact, one I'll mention it now because when we start doing some of these interventions, we did it in Colombia, then now we're doing it in India. More recently, we've been importing back to the UK one of these interventions. We are currently working in Peterborough, which is a town northeast of London, where we're doing similar interventions. And this is because the accumulation of human capital, especially in the early years, plays an important role in inequality, in the persistence of inequality across generations, the lack of social mobility, and the intergenerational transmission of poverty. Now, in studying human development, I think one of the most important things which was not clear to me, is that the process of human capital accumulation is actually much more complex than we are used to think about. And there are lots of things that we don't know. For instance, I think it's now pretty clear that the human capital is a multidimensional object. There are different dimensions that matter. They matter differently in the labor market, but also in the process of accumulation. For instance, some obvious ones. Cognition is obviously very important, but it's not the only thing. Social-emotional skills might be important, and within social-emotional skills, there might be, something that how driven is a person, how able is to interact with others, and the like. All these are aspects that might develop in different ways, and it might be playing an important role on the labor market. The dynamics is complex and very important. Very important both for understanding the process, but also if you're in the business of designing interventions, you want to identify where the windows of opportunity are, when should you intervene, and that's driven in partly by the dynamics. A few years ago, I was Sally Grada-McGregor gave me this data from Bangladesh. I will not show you those results today, but if you run a regression of IQ at age 6 on IQ at age 18 months, that's obviously significant. In those data, you also have some measures of cognitive ability at 7 months, which was something that at the time surprised me quite a bit. And when you run the same regression and you added cognitive ability at 7 months, that is significant, even after controlling for cognitive ability at 18 months, which tells me that the process is probably very complex one. We often use Markov assumptions to model the human capital accumulations, and not particularly granted. And also tells you that it might be the early years, as we'll see, are very important. The second thing that is important to understand is the behavior of important actors, in particularly parents, but also communities, and the role played by social norms. We were discussing social norms in the context of labor supply yesterday, but the same is true for parenting and investment in children, or the way schools are run. Now, why economics? When I started doing this work and talking to some of the people in child development, they would say, "Oh, you're an economist, so you're going to do the cost-benefit analysis of this." And sure, we can do that, but that's not the only reason. I think there are lots of insights that are gained by a number of these different disciplines, from nutrition to medicine to child development. However, I think it's important to think of a process as a whole and to look at all the important drivers of the process. And that's where, as economists, I think we have a role to play, especially when we think of the role played by choices that are determined by actors that make important decisions, like parents. And those decisions might be driven by resources, budget constraints, but also by attitudes, tastes, beliefs, and moreover, the interactions between different actors might be important. In this respect, I learned it the hard way doing this course that what I call genuine interdisciplinarity is very important. One issue that one has to solve is that lots of things get lost in translation when moving from a discipline to another. For instance, an obvious example is the way we think about causality. As economists, sometimes we use a different jargon from other sciences, but they do face similar problems. So today I'll be talking a lot about interventions that are targeted to the early years. And the early years are clearly very important for policy, and that's now quite well established. Partly because what happened to you in the early years is very important, has got very long-run consequences. I was saying earlier, the IQ at 7 months has an effect on IQ at 6 years, even after you're controlling for other things. But the other important thing is that the early years appear to be quite malleable. And it's partly because of by early years, I mean before age 3. That's partly because of the way the brain develops and humans develop. So to design effective interventions aimed at the early years is necessary to understand the process, including the role played by different actors. The other important challenge, and that's the number 2, is the challenge of scalability. And I'll be talking quite a bit about that. Now, we learned quite a bit about the process of human development, but there is still lots of things that we need to be learned. We need to learn. More importantly, I think that the issue of scalability has not been studied a lot. And there are lots of dimensions to scalability. One is the obvious one, is money. So to run a big program, you need quite a bit of money. But it's not the only thing. The logistics of it is important. And by that I mean to run a given interventions, you need on the field human capital, you need skills, you need infrastructure, you need a culture. And that brings me to the last point, what I call community ownership. Poor people receive, they talk to lots of individuals, and they have not good reasons to trust anyone. So especially if you want to do interventions that aim at changing individual behavior, you need to find a way to communicate with these people. And therefore, the ownership of a given intervention by the community, the identification of the channels through which reach out to these individuals to possibly change their behavior is very important. If I heard these things 15 years ago, I would say, that's whatever, money is important. And I do believe that money is important. But actually, I become convinced that there are some aspects of behavior that are driven by beliefs and by attitudes, which money is not the only, affordability is not the only thing that's quite important. I'll try to come back to this issue later. So let's talk about scalable interventions. If you think about the early years, there have been a number of interventions that have been proven to be effective and successful. Um, we have observed impacts that persist over time, well into adulthood. And this has been shown both in developed and developing countries. Um, these are examples of interventions in the US, the three of them. The first two are in red because I'll give you some numbers on them. Is the preschool program that Jim Heckman has studied extensively, and then the Abecedarian program in North Carolina, and more recently the NARS Family Partnership. And there are some examples in developing countries too. I will be talking a little bit about the Jamaica study, partly because he has inspired lots of the work that we've been doing now. But there are several studies, interventions that have been evaluated in Bangladesh as well. Let me give you some examples. Now, the reason I wanted to put these numbers is because they've been extremely influential. However, they're not lots of numbers, and they're not very big samples. So the preschool program is one, and we are talking about 123 kids in the 1960s. That they were identified in the town of Ypsilanti. So these were all black Afro-Americans, and they were identified as in a population of very disadvantaged. So they typically had a very low IQ at the start. And 58 of the 123 were randomly assigned to an intervention, which was very intense. Now, what is unique about this study is that these children were followed for over 40 years into adulthood. And these are some of the impacts that were found. Simply comparing treatment and control, these are significant. So, impacts on crime reduction, impacts on earnings, impacts on education, basic achievement, homework at 15, IQ, etc. An interesting aspect of this intervention is that on impact there was an effect on IQ at 5 years. Then this impact on IQ vanished, but there were impacts on other dimensions of human capital, the social-emotional skills, and you see them in adulthood on earnings, crime, etc. The Abecedarian was another intervention. This was 111 children. Now, if you think of, these are the two studies for which we have long-run effect. So it's 123 from Perry, 111 from Abecedarian. They are extremely important studies, but it's limited, especially if you want to think about scalability. So the Abecedarian was very intense. Was first from age 0 to 5, and then followed into primary school from age 6 to 8. There was both cognitive stimulation activities as well as supervised playing, and was 8 hours a day, every day of the week. And those are some impacts. This paper, again, Heckman is among the co-authors, was published in Science. And this impact in the long run on health outcomes. So you can see that there are very different dimensions that are affected by this early childhood development. The third example I want to give you, which for me personally has been extremely influential in pushing me in this direction, is the Jamaica study, the Sally Granta McGregor, with whom we have been working extensively. Initiated in the 70s in Jamaica, in Kingston. Here again is a small sample, 129 children. They were all stunted in Kingston, Jamaica, so undernourished. And they were randomly assigned to 4 groups. There's a control group. There's a group that received a stimulation intervention, a group that received a nutritional supplement, and a group that received them both. And the other unique aspect of this intervention is that it lasted for 2 years, started when the kids were about 1. But then they were followed, they were observed at the end of the interventions, and there were 7, 11, 17, 22, and they are currently collecting the data on a 30 years follow-up, which is pretty impressive. These were the impact studies. So this is the start of the interventions, that's the end of the interventions. These are IQ measures. This is the control group. This is the group that received the nutrition. This is the group that received the stimulation. And this is the group that received them both. These are children that were not stunted at baseline. They were not randomly assigned. They were outside the intervention, kind of a benchmark. And you can see that the impact is pretty large. At the end, by 2 years after the end of the interventions, there was a 0.8 standard deviation in terms of cognitive development of these children when combining the 2 interventions. Even more impressive is the long run. Now here, these are unstimulated children. Some receive the nutrition, some don't. And these are the stimulated children. The reason are only 2 groups because the nutrition intervention after 2 years fades out. The impact fades out. So that while, as you can see, the impact of this is the end of the interventions, the impact of the stimulation is huge at the end of it when the kids were 3. And then it goes down, but it persists. So even at age 17, 18, you find a significant difference in the cognition of these children.
These studies have so many outcomes, so they're not powered to pick up everything. So these effects kind of go out. Is it because they become 0, or is it just because they're not powered?
So these are point estimates. And if you look at these numbers, if you put standard errors, they are barely significant, if anything, at age 7. But then become more distinct. And so here they are not just a difference in the main outcome, but it's also statistically significant. Having said that, again, the sample sizes here are small. As I say, these are 129 kids. They lost a few, not very many, which is, they went to England to because this is Jamaica, so quite a few migrated, and they managed to find some of the migrants. So there is some attrition, but not much. But in any case, this is a small sample. Which brings me to the issue of scalability. So apart from the fact that, I've been talking about 3 interventions, there are a few others, but not many more than that. And so how much we can generalize is not completely obvious. But more importantly, these experiments, the Jamaica, but also the other ones, they were done under very controlled conditions. There was a lot of work put on by the people who designed the experiment. So thinking about, suppose you believe those results, suppose you believe that the intervention works. Now you want to implement the intervention on scale. It's not completely obvious how to do that. And so to better understand how we can generalize these findings and how do you design a scalable interventions, it's important to try to understand how the intervention works. And so you can focus when deploying this intervention on scale. You can focus on the aspects that actually do work.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
By scalability, do you also want to include general equilibrium effects as people flood into labor markets, or that's not what you mean by scalability?
Not at this stage. Not at this stage.
Okay. Just
Yeah.
want to understand where you're going.
Yeah. Yeah, that's obviously an important issue, but it's not what I'm talking about here. And that's what I mean by scalability. And first of all, I want to understand how the program works. And that's I will be mention a few things later. How it changes parental behavior. Lots of these interventions, they consist of, like the Jamaican one, there is a visitor that goes once a week and spends some time, an hour, with the mother and the child. Now it's difficult to imagine that this 1 hour a week will have, per se, an impact. And so probably what they're trying to do is to change parental practices. And so you need to measure that, and you need to understand why parents change behavior. And these are all the one I mentioned are not interventions that provide people with money or resources, but they try to change behavior. The third thing is how these ideas, if you manage to convince a few mothers to change their behavior for a while, do they take root? Do they stay there or they dissipate? And finally, understanding the political economy of this intervention is also extremely important. Fresana was mentioning I've done over the last few years quite a bit of work in evaluating public policies in different parts of the world. And one thing that I came to understand quickly is that often politicians don't particularly care about the impacts. They care about rentability of a given intervention. And so you see interventions that you prove to be effective to be shut down because they're not particularly rentable. And on the other hand, the interventions that are completely useless, but they're very politically rentable, so they are pursued. So we need to understand that aspect as well.
Can I ask a question? I just was wondering how the results of these very small-scale studies, where you have regular interactions with the parents, compare with the conditional cash transfers, where, so for example, the oportunidades in Mexico, where you just, in terms of the effect sizes, is there any?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's something that we've been thinking about recently quite a bit. There have been a few studies that have looked at the impact of CCD programs like Progressive Mexico on child development. And there are some impacts on nutritional status of kids, but as far as I know, there is nothing on child development. So say you measure cognition or social emotional skills and stuff, there is extremely little, if anything. There is not a huge amount of evidence, but there is something. Now, having said that, it's not to say that these programs are not useful, and they might be useful in more than one way. I mean, obviously, resources matter. If you're a child and you live in a family where your parents are extremely stressed by the hardship of economic conditions, that is more likely that you don't receive attention. But it's not just that. It's not just the provision of resources. It could be that some of these programs can provide the infrastructure to to deliver other interventions, like the stimulations. And I'll be going back to this issue later when I talk about the Colombian study. So the key presumption of some of these interventions that targeting families is important because you change parental behavior, and they can be more effective than simply giving transfers. So your question was quite well timed, I guess. And they can be even more effective because if you manage to change parental behavior, can be even more effective than interventions based on centers. So where children are taken to centers and you improve the functioning. But then if you believe that probably changing parental beliefs and practices is central to the success, Um, and therefore you want to know how does this thing happen, and how you change these practices. Um, and then the big question is, are there spillovers? So if you manage to convince some mothers to behave differently with their children, it might be the case that they affect other mothers. One thing that for me was quite striking. I've been seeing some of these interventions in different parts of the world. I've been going to talk to mothers in Colombia, in India, in China, in different places. And one thing that struck me is that some of the interventions we do encourage mothers to talk to their children. We're talking about children about 1, 2 years old. And so there is a lot of emphasis on stimulating the child by talking, by involving the child in everyday activities. And one question that I listened to so many times from the mothers involved into this program is they say, oh, why should I talk to her? She doesn't understand what I say. And so there is this perceptions that lots of parents living in those conditions have, that stimulation is not necessarily a useful thing to do. And there is the misperception that to learn language, to learn how to operate, you have to interact, you have to engage the child. And that's not necessarily an activity that requires resources, economic resources, directly at least. So what makes an intervention scalable? Obviously, financial resources are important, but also the availability of human resources and logistics, and the ownership and community participation. And these last two aspects, programs like the CCT can be particularly important. So what I'll do in this lecture is I will talk of some studies that we've been doing that try to evaluate scalable interventions. And what we have done is either worked with existing welfare programs or proposed programs that can be, that's the case of the studies in Colombia we've done, or proposed programs that could be implemented at scale. And that's the case in India. Here, this is an important point that I wanted to put, because we discussed about these issues a lot. For instance, in the work we're doing now in Orissa, there is a tension for us. On the one hand, you want to do an intervention that is useful and that has an impact, but you want to refrain from doing too well, in the sense that you don't want to spend too much money, because otherwise you do something that is not going to be scalable. Obviously, if you can take a child and ship it to Switzerland in some college, that you'll have an impact, but that's not feasible. And so there is this tension. On the one hand, you want to understand how to obtain something effectively, but you want to stay within a set of intervention that is scalable. So these are some of the current studies that we've been working. The first study we did was in Colombia, was based on home visitings. There was a nutrition component, lasted 18 months. The children at the beginning of the intervention were between 12 and 24 months. We did 96 towns. These are all going to be randomized controlled trials. And so the randomization was done across towns in the different arms. The beneficiaries were recipients of the conditional cash transfer program. We finished that. There are some papers that have been published on that study. This was an important point because in Colombia, the CCT, the Conditional Cash Transfer Program, was everywhere. And the way it works is that every 50 beneficiaries, they elect a representative, one of them, and this woman is in charge of the relationship between the beneficiaries and the program. So if there is an issue about delayed payment, etc. We've done work 10 years ago evaluating that intervention. One thing that we noticed was that the women who are the representatives are different. You know, I could walk into a meeting with a bunch of beneficiaries, and I can tell you right away who was the representative, because they're smarter, they're better dressed, they are more educated, they are more entrepreneurial. They are called madre líder in Spanish. And in fact, they have this leadership quality. So the idea was, we have this infrastructure of the CCT program. We know who the madre líderes are, which says that the program is identifying human capital in the field. So we could use that knowledge to run the interventions. And so what we did there was to hire and train the madre líderes to deliver the stimulation intervention. So one of the issues of scalability, you know, when you run a small experiment, you can have your researchers, you can have specialized people to run the interventions. When you do it at scale over a country, you don't know who's going to do this stuff. And the interaction with the mother is going to be important. So in the case of the study in Colombia, what we did was to use an existing welfare program to identify potential actors that could deliver the intervention. That was the representatives. And so that was quite important for us. Now, talking about political feasibility, when we showed the results that we got at the time, which were positive, at least on impact, on the cognition of the children, we showed it to the government, and they said, great, this is very useful. And then they did nothing of it. The reason they did nothing of it was because they say, oh, why do you work with the CCT guys? These guys are supposed to deliver money, not to do child development. Child development is done by different agencies. So there were these political jealousies across agencies. And so what we did eventually was start a new study where we tried to evaluate a program that was already in place, run by the agency that does child development, and trying to improve that. So that gives you another aspect of scalability, which is you need to work with the political situation and the way things are run in a country. The third study we show some result about was what we call this a pilot, because it was our first approach to do something like that in India. We did in Cuttack in Orissa, and we randomized across 54 slums. This was relatively small, 378 children relative to this side. They were, again, between 1 and 2 at the baseline. It lasted for 18 months. Didn't have a nutrition component. These were migrants in the slums of Cuttack, and it's finished. I'll show you some results. And now we are doing this big one. This is probably the largest study I have done in my life. It's 192 villages in rural Orissa. Here we do both home visits. So there are different groups. One is home visits. One is group, what we call group visits, or play groups. The children were younger, a start between 7 and 16 months, and the intervention lasted a bit longer, was 24 months. It's all rural. The first part of the study is completed. I'll tell you a bit more about the second part of the study that is happening now. So basically, we took the same 192 villages and re-randomized them into a new intervention, I'll tell you. And then some study we are doing with childcare. These are a bit older children. There are 3 at baseline in Ghana. So let me talk a little bit about the home visits and the stimulation. The basic structure was guided by the Jamaica experiment. Sally Granta McGregor was the designer of that, and she's been working with us on this. There are some, relative to the original Jamaica study, there are some novelties. Again, the intervention is the emphasis on designing a program that uses local resources in a scalable fashion. While the Jamaica study was done just in Kingston, there was 129 children in Kingston. Now we work on a fairly large scale. In the case of Colombia, we did this in 7, what the Colombians call departments, which are states. They are 4 times the size of England, just to give you an idea of how large that. And we now do in Orissa is in 3 different districts. And so we try to mimic the scalable delivery at the implementation. And whenever possible, we use the government infrastructure. I already told you the one in Colombia. The second intervention we are doing in India with in Orissa for the older children is in the Anganwadi centers, and it works with the ICDS and the government of Orissa. And then the research design, we put an emphasis not just in evaluating the impact of an intervention, but also trying to understand the mechanism, and that involves collecting lots and lots of data. As I said, much of the content of the intervention is based on the curriculum developed by Sally Granta McGregor and collaborators, and it promotes child development in an integrated manner, different dimensions, encourages mothers to interact with their children in everyday activities, involve other children and members of the family where possible, and development activities are done during the home visits, and practice in principle between visits. There is a little bit of materials, but not a huge amount, and use recycled materials to make toys. That's a fun part of the program. These are some pictures of the visits, just to give you an idea. These were in Cuttack in Orissa, and give you an idea of the type of materials we use, the type of activities. That's a mother, and that's her child, and this is the home visitor. So she's encouraging her to do this activity directly. Again, this is the mother, and that's the child, and that's the home visitor. That's some of the materials. So these are.
The mother is invariably present.
Yes.
So
Either the mother or the main child giver.
So I presume that the objective here is some identification of what the channels are. Is it because the mother's learning how to interact with the child, or is it the home visit per se? Do these studies allow us to distinguish?
Yes, that's why we try to collect the information. In the study in Colombia, I will not talk about those results, but in the Colombia study, which is the first one, we first did the first paper, which we published in a medical journal, which we simply compare the treatment to control outcomes, the child development. In the second paper, which is going the rounds through the economic journals, it's almost there, we try to understand exactly that. Is the program per se, or is something else? And the story we have in that paper is an MBR working paper, if you want to look it up, is that the intervention obtained its impact through a change in investment. So think of it as a production function of human capital with certain parameters. Those parameters stay the same. It's not that intervention made investment more productive or increased the productivity of the production function. Rather, the intervention shifted the investment. So in the towns where we implemented the intervention, parental investment in time and materials increased tremendously. So the idea here is that what the intervention does is not that the child gets exposed for an hour a week to that visit, that the child develops better. It's rather the fact that somehow we change the way mothers do their stuff. As a consequence of that, one other, I will not be talking about that at all, but it's very close to my heart, so let me mention it. We've been starting to collect data on maternal beliefs about the process of human capital development. So we go to mothers and ask what is the production function and what are its parameters? Or rather, we ask a number of questions that allow us to evaluate those numbers. And then we want to check whether the intervention changes the perceptions or the usefulness. This relates to some interesting anthropological literature on child development that says that different parents have different ideas about the process. Middle class and rich parents, they understand that stimulating children might be important. Poor parents seem to have an idea that children just grow and they develop naturally. So there is an anthropologist called Annette Leroux that calls this model as a pursuit of natural growth. So investment is not particularly useful unless the child runs into problems. And that's where now this model is wrong because we know that stimulation is important. But however, it seems to be the model that lots of poor parents use when they make their choices. And that's what the intervention tries to change. There was a question there.
So my question is, so if I'm getting it right, so your home visit is actually you're helping how the mother should interact with the child. That is the purpose of the home visit, like how a mother should in present of the representative. That you're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
That how she should interact with the child.
Yeah, that's the main idea.
Okay.
Okay, so those are some of the puzzles we use. These are conversation scenes. These are from the Orissa thing. That's another visit. Again, the mother and the home visitor. These are visits in Colombia, just to show you the similarities between these are very, very different contexts, and yet, the nature of the visits is, you see, here is a grandmother. She gets involved somehow. The purpose is to try to involve whoever is present. This is the subject child. These are friends. That's the mom, and she shows one of the dolls, and she's done. That's another visit in Katak, and yet another one. That's some other material. That's a conversation scene in Colombia, and those are. I love this picture. These are the toys that are built from recycled material. This was done in Colombia. And so you can, Sally is amazing. Sally can build a toy out of almost anything. So these are little plastic bottles and they become cars and all that. So those are Katak. So the scalability stuff. What we did was to adapt the Sally's curriculum, which is now called Reach Up and Learn, to the relevant local context. We worked in collaboration with local partners. Here in India, we worked at CESET, at the Ambedkar University here in Delhi. They helped us to adapt the content of the curriculum to the specific culture. The delivery of the curriculum relied on the home visitors, but also on mentors. So the home visitors are local women. The mentors are more educated, but they play an important role. They train the home visitors, and then they keep in touch with them. So the home visitors I mentioned in Colombia, they were elected representative of the widespread CCT program. In India, we implemented this intervention with Pratham. So these were people that Pratham has a large. Oh boy, I'm late. And as I mentioned, local women are important because they are closely connected to the communities and therefore well placed to deliver the material, and they can be instrumental for the acceptance of the program. The mentors play a crucial role as they train the home visitors. And after training, the mentors kept going to the communities on a regular basis and interact with them. In Colombia, they were seeing the home visitors every 5 or 6 weeks. In India, it's been much more intensive. Every week, there is a contact with things. So that's about the content of the intervention. Let me skip that because I do want to show you some results. And Fasana, tell me that I only have 5 minutes. This is some of the research question. When is optimal to start? There's something that, talking to the child development people, if you ask them that question, they don't know the answer. And so, is it better to start at 12 months or 18 months or 7 months? We don't really know that. And how long should the intervention be? Should be 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. So those are background characteristics. So those are data from Colombia. Just to give that's the average age and birth weight. In Colombia, about 11% of the kids were, 12% were stunted. About over 40% of them were anemic at baseline. 40% of the mothers were depressed. So that's a stressful situation. These are data from Orissa. The nutritional condition is worse than in Colombia. So those are the impacts. This is the impacts we measured with the Bailey's test of infant and toddler development. We got a 0.26 standard deviation effect on cognition in Colombia, and a 0.3. These are data from impacts from Katak in the slums. And those are the big ones. There is something on receptive language and expressive language, and not much on fine motor skills, but neither we're expecting anything there. In Colombia, we didn't find any impact of the macronutrient supplementations. That's another chapter. I could talk about it, but I don't have the time now. In Katak, one thing that surprised us and surprised the Pratham people running intervention, most of the impact was on boys and very little on girls. We don't fully understand why that's the case, but if you look at on cognition, on boys is 45% of standard deviation, and for girls is 25 and not really significant. Same thing on receptive language is 0.5 of a standard deviation on boys and 0 on girls.
I think by the calculation it says that mothers generally talk more to girls and less to boys.
We thought about that possibility, and you do find that at baselines the girls were more advanced. Still, we were surprised by this because, we went back, after getting these results, we went back and talked to our visitors and to the supervisors. They were as surprised. They couldn't see a huge difference in the behavior towards boys, in the intervention towards boys than girls, but that's what we find. The second one, the impact is larger on mothers with a slightly better education. And you can tell a story of how that happens. Mechanisms, I was saying, this is evidence from Colombia that shows that the intervention increases parental investment. So homemade toys, boy toys, play materials, everything, play activities, you do find significant impact of the intervention on these things. In Orissa, we find, again, an impact on the quality of the home environment, as mentioned by standardized, it's almost 0.3 of a standard deviation. There is and that's unique for Orissa. We don't find that in Colombia, a reduction in maternal depression symptoms. There is no impact on maternal knowledge of child development. I think that's partly an issue with the tool that is used to measure maternal knowledge. How costly is the intervention? The India one costs about $170 per child per year. The Colombia one is more expensive, but the GDP in Colombia is higher than here. It's about $500 per child per year. About 50% of this cost is supervision. So these are the mentors. And therefore, at scale, one could probably reduce these costs. Now, I think these are important numbers because they tell you whether some programs are scalable or not. Some people might think that this is a large number, and so I guess we need to discuss that with the ICDIs. Colombia is more expensive. On the other hand, the government does interventions on children that cost 3 times as much, and have no impact. So, I think it's useful to have these numbers and start a discussion with the policymakers about them. Have the group things. There is one. Okay, let me say one thing about groups. So the new thing we are doing in Orissa, rather than having home visits, so I have a visitor going to the home of each child, we also have a model in Orissa where a group of mothers, 12 mothers, come with their children, and so it's obviously much cheaper because the visitor can cover in 1 hour 12 children. We thought it might be very diluted. But it turns out that there are advantages to groups in the sense that you can, if the visitor is smart and well trained, she can use some of the mothers as role model. And moreover, in the villages, you find that some mothers are very isolated, and the groups are a way to build up networks and relationship. So those are important aspects. Let me skip the groups in Colombia, but I want to show you some preliminary stuff about the Cuttack, the Orissa intervention. So these are the 3 districts in Orissa where we are operating. And what we do there, so we had the original 192 villages. We divided in 4 groups. So one gets control, one gets just a nutritional education, so it's a bit enhanced control if you want. And then they have the individual simulation, the group simulation. Then we re-randomize the same villages, and we try to improve their Anganwadi centers. So this will allow us to look at the interactions between an early intervention and a late intervention. So that's very exciting. So this part is finished now, finished in December last year. So we are doing this one now. We are working with the Anganwadi Center. This was really hard to do because in the first case, we just worked with Pratham. We went to the homes and we delivered the interventions. This one we had to do with the ministry. So we had to get permission to go into Anganwadi centers. So it took us 18 months just to get the letter signed, to get the authorization to go. So, but it's working now, and will be finished in a year or so. So those are some of the groups. So these are the impacts on the first one. So these are really hot the press in a way. So the nutritional intervention has no effect. These are the group interventions. These are the individual interventions, and we get quite large 0.3 impacts, both in the group. This is condition and language. Cognition and language, and we see it both in the groups and in the individual visits, and we see it at midline and at line. So this is 12 months after the beginning and 24 months after the beginning. So the first results are quite promising, and yeah, now that we're doing these are the enhanced Anganwadi centers, and hopefully. I'll skip the Ghana, so let me just put the picture of the impacts in Ghana, and I'll stop there.
So this question is kind of related to another question that was asked, whether the intervention is about the mentor or it's the mother. So related to that, I think the question is also of whether it's really the time that you're spending with your mother or whether it's the material that you're getting at that time, right? And to me, that's also kind of related to this difference that you see with the girls and boys, because there's this literature which talks about, if I think of this as in some way as a negative incentive, right? Because boys would like to play in the playground, but now they're being forced to spend that time with mothers. And there's a lot of literature which actually says that boys react to that negative incentive while girls don't. Right? So I don't know whether it's that. I mean, that's also interesting because that would mean a lot in terms of the resources also. Because if it's just the time that you're spending with the mother that's important, it can be done in a cheaper way. And also, this formal, it's a little bit formalized, right? When you have this material. And there is the literature which talks about actually education, the early childhood education, it's better for kids to start school later. Right? So better to start formal education later.
Yeah, there are lots of interesting stuff in your question. I could talk about it for half an hour.
We can select a few more questions.
Okay.
So I'm wondering about the relative, if you compare, so is it really the time constraint? Sorry. Thanks for the talk. So I was wondering about the relative importance of time constraint versus the resource constraint for the mothers. So if you are getting the effects on child cognition, and did you check intermediary outcomes as the time spent by the mother? So if, and the second question is, if you find that the time spent by the mothers have increased, so are they now cutting back from, let's say, some other activities, like these mothers might be working outside? So is it, I'm trying to understand the role of, you mentioned beliefs. So is it like the, improper beliefs, or is it about time or resource constraint? And if both are working, how would you rank them?
Let me take another one.
So I'm just trying to understand your result about the effect on cognition of mother's education or mother's level of education. So do you observe some baseline differences in cognition based on mother's education?
Okay, these are all very good questions. The answer to the last one, which is the easiest one in a way, is yes. So we do observe that there is an effect of mother education both on their investment and on outcomes on the children. Interestingly, if you model it, typically education and parental background variables have an effect on. So if you run a regression on cognition and parental education, yeah, that's significant. However, if you model it, this effect is completely mediated through investment. Now, of course, there is some issues about how you identify this causality link, but the plausible story is that better educated mothers invest more or better, and that has an effect on their children development. Now, in the other two questions, in the Colombia study, which is the one we have more time to do, India, we haven't done it yet, but we distinguish time and material investment. And what we do find in Colombia is that material investment is more important for cognition. So books and toys, that's what seems to be important. While for social emotional skills, is time investment, which is more important. In terms of what the program does, the program tries to use the time that it's not just spending time with your child, it's spending the time in a productive way. And so what the curriculum does, it tries to encourage the mother, if you're cleaning, if you're sweeping the floor, talk to your child about it. Explain the role of objects. Explain how you do the dishes, how you prepare the food. So it tries to encourage the connection. Now, in terms of the beliefs, we haven't looked yet, partly because we collected this data recently, the effect that these interventions have on beliefs. But we do have some data from Colombia on beliefs. That's the first data we collected. This is in collaboration with Flavio Cunha. There we find that typically our groups underestimate the productivity of investment. So they don't realize how important time investment and material investment is. So the idea we have is that hopefully what the intervention does is to change their perception of this process and stress the importance of investment.
So I'm wondering, since you have studied urban and rural settings, do you find a systematic difference in these kind of investments across rural and urban that is not linked to pure endowment? So I'm just thinking about the fact that maybe parents consider, cognition and language skills and these more in urban settings because they feel there may be returns in the labor market to some of these skills, whereas maybe in more agrarian societies, villages, people have a perception that these things don't matter as much, and therefore they invest less.
Yeah.
I found it a nice way to have like also decrease in maternal depression, because I think maybe like the study also provides I know like an improvement of feeling of agency by mothers, and because there are studies actually that like link maternal depression to poor child cognitive skills, and I mean also like interaction with a visitor, probably new activity. So do you pursue this channel in any other way? I don't know.
Maybe this is more relevant for the Columbia intervention, but do you think that this intervention is also inducing desirable behavior in mothers in terms of investment in their children's education, health? Because you follow these children over time, right? So the result is because of their better schooling choices or just because of the intervention that happened early in the years?
Okay. So let me try to answer the questions. The first one, urban, rural, that's interesting. If you look at, say, Orissa, and you look at kids in Cuttack, in the slums, and compare them to kids in the villages, typically you observe worse delays in the rural setting. Although, if you go and visit the places, the slum look worse. At least to my eye. Probably because the slums, the urban setting gives more stimulation, more similar to the child. The rural kids, they don't get exposed. Having said that, we haven't done yet a strict comparison of the effect of the interventions in rural and urban setting. The urban, the slums intervention that was done a couple of years ago, and now we have the data and it's finished. The rural one is basically, I got those tables a few weeks ago, and so it's very new. We haven't done much yet. The maternal depression, yeah, we were very excited about the fact that in Cuttack we do see an impact. We don't see that in Colombia on maternal depression. We still have to investigate whether that's the main channel through which the impact is observed. We do not see any difference between girls and boys, mothers, in terms of depression. The one of following kids in the long run, it is a possibility. That's why we're quite excited about the new work in Orissa, where we now follow the kids into the Ankanwadi centers, but I don't have that evidence yet.
Okay, to close the session, ma'am, we'll carry the conversation on